Hey, how's it going, Kyle?
It's going good. How are you doing, Drew? Sorry, I was just getting settled.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks for thanks for making the time.
Yeah, no
Let's
worries. I'll full disclosure, I'm very poorly read into this meeting. It was on my calendar and I was like, great, talk to Kyle and Albert.
oh man. Well, originally the intent here was just for Albert and I, and if you want to participate and ask questions, but really Albert to kind of talk through the test file finder implementation in the GitLab project. And then I had a few of the questions that we talked about in the last stakeholder call that I was just gonna ask. And yeah, we can kind of go from there. But feel free to jump in, like by all means, jump in, participate. Any questions you have, you know, this would be the time to ask them too.
Awesome. Cool, thanks.
Albert, how are you doing?
Hey.
Oh, I think you're muted. So
Hey, good to see you again.
Yeah.
Hey, Drew.
Hey.
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yes.
Albert, I was wondering if you could just maybe share your screen and talk through, like we could get things started, just talking through the implementation of test file finder, how the mapping is generated, everything feeds into it.
Okay. So are we following the issue as an agenda? The record overview of pipeline job circuit discussion.
Yeah, we can do that. I had some other questions on dynamic mapping that I'll add in, but it's essentially those that we discuss covering these things.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Then let's just go through what we have right now.
Okay.
Yep. I'll share my screen. Okay. So this diagram is just an overview of how our pipeline looks like right now. So small part of it. So we have 3 stages. We have the prepare stage, test stage, and then post-test stage. So prepare stage is where we are using the test file finder. We use it to detect the test that we need to run for a particular MR based on the changes in the MR. So this is where the test file finder is used in. So it creates a base of test files. We pass that list later on to the RSpec job, RSpec Failfast, which runs just this limited number of tests in parallel to the other existing RSpec jobs that we have as per normal. So yeah. So and then for this pipeline, the special thing is that when the Failfast jobs fails, we have a subsequent job in the next stage, which looks at failures for this job and then make an API call to terminate the pipeline earlier. Yeah, so it does it by using a cancel API, but it still gives us the same feedback in terms of a failed pipeline to the user. So it still appears as a failed pipeline instead of a cancel. But you'll still see canceled jobs. But in essence, it gives us shorter feedback from that.
And
yeah, so go on.
A few quick questions there. So those lines, that's all needs association. So it's not like waiting for the full stage before moving on to the next. It's once the job that the lines connect finishes, it moves on to the next job.
No,
right?
No, these are not related to any tag or anything. It's just to illustrate the dependencies. Yeah.
So
between this this job and this job, there are other jobs, like for example, setting up the test environment and other things. Yeah, it's not a direct relationship.
Okay,
for this one, I can't recall, but I think it is. Yeah, just let me check. Yep, it's that it has a needs relationship.
Okay,
yep.
Cool. And then the detect test job, this is a question I probably should have started with. Does that uses this how does that work? Can you just refresh my memory on that?
So this job uses test file finder. It takes the mrdiff, looks at the list of files changed in the mrdiff, pass it to the test file finder, and then the test file finder will then create a list of the test files specifically that needs to be run, based on the mapping that we have, the static mapping. So this is the mapping that we have in GitLab. So it maps basically like application code to the spec, and then some additional relationships between like EE and force code. Looks at, yeah. So this is the main thing, how this is, like for example, let me see. So here we have, so in GitLab, we have the EE extension code, which is usually used to extend, to extend a force code with some EE specific implementation. So in that case, when the EE specific code is changed, we also want to run a test for the force, the corresponding class in force. So this is, yeah, something that's unique to the GitLab code base that we want to address as well. Yeah, other than that, we have other things like schema migrations and or various kinds of things.
Cool.
Any questions so far?
Well, I should add the context. Some of the questions I'm asking are for like Ricky and James who aren't here too.
Yep.
Just so that we don't gloss over stuff. So I do appreciate you going into that detail.
Yeah.
That's it for me as far as questions on that piece. Drew, you have any?
Does Drew have any question? Feel free to ask if you have any questions. Or stop
yeah,
me.
no. This looks great. I don't have anything yet. Keep going, please.
Okay. Yeah. So that's as far as the test file finder is being used right now. Is there anything else? Yeah, that's how we're using test file finder for now.
So just to recap, we're using a test file finder gem for identifying the files that are changed from the mrdiff and detect test. We run those, we create an artifact or something that we pass on to the RSpec Failfast job. And then when that one completes, if it fails, then the fail pipeline early job will cancel everything else that's still running.
Yeah. So if we look at this, so let's say this takes 10 minutes, and like I think majority of our tests runs at about 15 minutes per job. So at 10 minutes, if this fails, this will kick in, cancels all the remaining jobs here that may still be running for another 5 to 10 minutes. And yeah, so that's where we can shorten the pipeline.
So, and we separated the actual execution of the RSpec test and detecting the test files because like our project has a bunch of dependencies and environment things that need to get built in between.
Yes.
Okay. So for a typical kind of startup Rails app, that wouldn't really be necessary. But for something like, because of our build process, we have to do that.
Yes and no. I would think it really depends on project basis. I would say what the project needs to do before they can run a test. Yeah. An out of the box Rails app, yes, probably it will work. But to what extent that can sustain, I'm not sure. Yeah, I won't be able to.
Yeah.
And we do that, like we do all of those things so that we do it once when we run job, like RSpec jobs split out so much, correct? And other jobs, but let's just say RSpec for this example, like that's the intent. So large projects that would be splitting their test out would potentially have a similar pattern, or they'd be incurring like a gem install and environment setup cost on every single build for their test jobs. Okay.
And the value of doing that first is that we skip our spec Failfast entirely if we don't detect anything to run?
Yes. So
Okay.
if we don't detect anything to run, most of the time there will be something to run.
Yeah.
Because if a code changes, it's very likely that a test needs to be run. I think if there is no test fast at all, then this will just do nothing. It will not run any
Yeah.
aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
The other thing that we needed to take care of was if this list gets too large. For example, let's say an MR changes like 600 files, for example,
Right.
a huge refactor. So in such cases, we will decide not to run this at all because it makes it's more worthwhile to just run all the tests as per normal instead of running it in a single job, because we will be duplicating. First, we'll be duplicating the effort of testing it, and second is that this job is not parallelized at the moment. So when a number of files gets too large, it will take longer, and the fail early mechanism will not be beneficial.
Right.
Because the rest of the jobs will complete in, let's say, for example, 15 minutes. This job takes half an hour to complete. So even if this fails, there's nothing to cancel anymore because the rest of the jobs have completed. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That all makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other context to maybe add here is these all run when there are code changes, right, Albert? So like we break our pipeline graph up into like, if only docs files change, these jobs will never run based on the changes implementation within the pipeline. So maybe some MRs that you're thinking where, hey, there probably wouldn't be any tests here. It's likely never going to run this job in those circumstances because of how changes at the pipeline configuration level is implemented. Cool.
What would happen if we moved the process of detecting tests into the RSpec Failfast job in the test stage? Like in the context of our project, what would? Yeah.
I think it is possible. I think why I put it as a separate job in the beginning was because I was thinking also about how we might want to do this fail-fast mechanism in these different ways. Like for example, like RSpec, we're currently running it like on different levels, unit, integration, migration, and etc. So I was wondering if we might one day need to do that. If we need to do that, then it's separate because this might take time, and we don't want to repeat this process.
Yeah, for sure. And also I'm thinking that if it happens quickly, like that might run before a lot of this other stuff gets started. If there's other dependencies and things,
Also, if we want to parallelize this job itself, we also don't want to necessarily run that as many times. Because how we parallelize this will depend on how many test files we are getting out of this.
Right, and so having that as a like source of truth for then, however many, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, so I was going to ask, we deviated from the CI template quite a bit. Like we used the test file finder, and I think that was kind of our goal, but we deviated quite a bit. Albert, is there any ideas on what patterns here or anything that could be brought back into the Failfast CI template? Or is our implementation just very opinionated for our use case right now?
I think the template would be useful if it can help to detect the test, because this is something that isolated. I would say it's very uniform in a lot of projects. You take an MR, look at a diff, and determine what test needs to be run for that MR, for example. And then, so I feel like the outcome for the boundary between the template and the user's configuration will be this list of files. Yeah, I think if a template can help a user to produce this, it would be very helpful. And then the user or the engineers can take these files, run the test however they want it to be, however suits their project, then they can do that. I think that's the very least that you can do, I think. Yeah. And then I think that also will lead on to the next steps that we might want to consider. If we want to consider dynamic mapping, etc. All that complexity will go into this part of the job, part of the pipeline, and not so much in terms of how the jobs are run. It's different projects have different ways of running tests. I think it's best to leave that. Yeah, so I think it's best to leave the execution of the test to the project.
Yeah, and that, I think that is a good point. That I think we sort of consciously made that decision with test file finder that we're not going to get into execution. And so I think you're right about the artifact being a good ideal output for the job. That it's like we're not really doing your execution for you because we probably won't do it right. But we know we can give you this list of high risk files or whatever. And that I think that makes a lot of sense given what the test file finder is really doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, then that with how test file finder is currently, it leaves the decision of finding out what's important to the user as well. Like they can put in the mapping as needed based on the project. And then the templated job will then do the execution of. Based on that, gives them a list of files that they need, test files that they need to do based on what is known within that MR, and then give it back to the user to then take it on from there. Yeah, so I think I feel like the test file finder should be focusing on this part, the earlier part of the pipeline.
And then maybe accompany it with documentation that says, here's some reference implementation of consuming that artifact and like getting efficiency benefits within your pipeline. Right. Cool. I did want to talk about the dynamic mapping a bit. Drew, did you have any questions on these items before we move into that? Like anything else here?
No, actually the next thing I was kind of thinking about was actually the mapping. So this is probably a good direction.
Cool. Albert, I know you've done a lot of analysis, like looking at Crystal Ball and other ways of doing this. I just thought I'd ask, like, what are your thoughts on how we can evolve the GitLab project pipeline with dynamic mapping? And then how do you see that relating to test file finder, like what the responsibilities we just talked about are, and maybe what the gem can actually do? I know there's a lot to unpack there, but that was in essence what I wanted to try to get out of this part of the discussion.
Sure. Let me share my screen again. Yeah, so this is the mapping that we have now. I think, yeah, so the next thing we probably want to get at is how to be smarter about creating this mapping, because in this, at the moment, there's a lot of assumptions, and I think there may be different scenarios that we miss in this based on what we know at the moment. So we can move this towards a dynamically generated map. I think that would be great. I think that's the first step to take. Where that would fall within the gem, I'm still not sure about that yet. If it is part of the gem, it might be like a separate component within the gem to generate a mapping, because it knows format of mapping. So I guess that is one way of creating the mapping. But I feel that there is still this is still open to different ways of generating as long as it follows this expected interface that the test file finder gem has already defined. So I think that's one good thing about where we are right now. We are open to different ways of getting to what we need, which is a mapping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A quick question about our mapping here. How,
Yeah.
and this is obviously projects, this will always kind of be project specific, but how much of this mapping is, I'm reading it here, generalized to, because I was thinking about extensible mappings, right? Because if we're going to lean into, we're just going to produce this list of files for you, I think getting started with having a user have to configure as little as possible is great. So if we had a mapping that, we could say, okay, mapping is Rails, and then also this like one other weird directory that I have is a specific thing. Do you think that would reduce the amount of reduce the time to set this up?
Yes and no, I think. I think there is a middle ground there, which I also thought before, which is probably we might want to be able to take in multiple mapping, for example. So I think that could really help. For example, if let's say the template has a default mapping and then the user wants to add on with some customized maps that they need to customize for, and yeah, I think that could help there. And also, I think what we have experienced with this is that there's a lot of back and forth in the mapping. Like there's a lot of tweaking, experimenting, and then we realize something was missed, and then we need to add on to a new one. So having multiple mapping files, supporting multiple mapping files might be an option. It might help to solve that pain point as well. And then it could make it more modular as well. Sometimes a single file might get too complex.
Right. I mean, it's definitely simpler from an implementation standpoint. We're not like actually having to mush the files together.
And the other possible benefit I was thinking of is that we can still have this static mapping, and then as we move towards a dynamic mapping, then we could iterate on the dynamically generated map, and then combine that together with the current static map that we have to give us a more comprehensive mapping. I think that's one of the biggest concerns for me, mostly. If we were to move into a dynamic mapping at this point, I feel like we need to get to a parity with the static mapping. Because because we can only have one file. We need to get that file to parity with what we have right now in order to be as effective. But we don't know what it takes to get there at this point, or how long it will take, how many iterations.
Right. Which is that's probably a good case for multiple mappings too, so we can actually work with them in parallel.
Yeah. And just to cycle back to the dynamic mapping, like the general idea would be the implementer, like the developer would generate the dynamic map outside of TFF, but then feed it in this format so that the files detected would essentially work the same. So like from a responsibility perspective, dynamic mapping probably doesn't make sense to build into the gem, but it's an implementation decision that would feed into the mapping that the gem uses, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
I think it could be packaged as part of the gem, but it should be like a different entry point, I would say, from the test file finder as it is now. Yeah.
Well, because that would require not necessarily hooking into, but some level of integration with the execution. Am I?
Yes and no. Yeah.
So I mean,
So it depends on how the dynamic generation is, what the approach is. I think if it is based on like call graph, then yes, it needs to hook into the test execution, and then it needs, yeah, so that it will be able to correlate between the test files and the test execution path. I would say, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It needs to hook into the execution, which is why I also mentioned earlier that I think it should not be the same entry point between the binary that is currently creating the artifact versus the binary that creates the mapping. So I feel like, yeah, exactly, those are the two entry points. Like one is for creating the artifact and one is for creating the mapping on its own. So yeah, then I feel like it becomes like a cycle. So we need one in order for the other to execute properly. Yeah.
And just a real quick question, because we were looking to add dynamic mapping as a part of our Q4 OKRs. Do you think we should, so like either if testing can implement multiple mapping files, great, but if not, should we look at taking that on before we even proceed with?
Yeah, I think we might be able to take that on before we proceed, because I think that will help us make smaller iterations as we move towards dynamic mapping.
Yeah. Okay.
And not lose confidence on what we already have right now.
Okay. I know we're at time.
Yeah.
I'm okay running a little bit over. I don't know if anyone else is. Albert,
yeah,
are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay. I'm done with questions. So I was just going to open it up to Drew to see if he had any more before we leave that.
No, I mean, I'm super excited about this dashboard that we can actually like see how how it's going.
Switch to it. Yeah.
I think there's, yeah, I think the only and I'm not even sure I know what question I'm asking here, but the only part that I'm a little bit fuzzy on is that connection between our detection and the execution, because that seems very open-ended. So is it going to be a matter of like kind of picking tools and saying, okay, we're going to pick this tool and we can integrate with that and it'll know how to work with that execution tool, and then another one, and just adding more tools that we know how to talk to? Or is there a more generalized way to approach that?
I think from what I've seen, like in other, so I've looked at the Crystal Ball gem. I've also looked a little bit into the Shopify's way of doing things. I think, yeah, it's very customized. I think, yeah, it needs to be. Oh, yeah, we need to know the tools that we want to hook into and how do those tools provide the data that we need. So yeah, I think if we want to take such approach, then that gem needs to be adaptable, I would say, to these different methods.
Yeah, that makes sense. But and so it's going to have to be like a tool by tool basis.
Yeah.
But Albert, is it fair to say, like, as we look towards dynamic mapping, we would look for our miss rate metric on that dashboard to decrease? So like, that's how we're going to evaluate successes. I would think maybe a moving average would improve over time. And then that's when we'll start to consider moving out a portion of unit. Like if we feel confident that we're not missing on unit tests, we can remove unit tests from the MR pipeline and just do it in there.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking about before this call, actually. So right now what we have here is just miss rate of the Failfast job versus the entire pipeline. We might want to look at this on a more granular level, like against the different aspect jobs, and see if because we might be getting, I don't know, just take a number, for example, like 70% match on unit, and then majority of this misses are maybe could be from integration or system. So if we would actually look at this individually, we might be able to start substituting this out bit by bit instead of as a whole pipeline. So yeah, that might give us some incremental value as well.
And just to double check, that miss rate is the rate of, that's our rate of false negatives. That's the number of passing fail-fast jobs that are followed by a failed pipeline.
Yes, exactly.
Got it.
Is it a failed pipeline or a failed RSpec job?
Failed. I think it's failed one of RSpec jobs.
Yeah.
So yeah, one of these 4 RSpec jobs.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for clarifying, Carl.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I like your idea to break it out. If we can at least even look at unit integration system, that would be great. I can help with that if you need some help. But it looked like you already broke it out in the query to make that possible too.
I was working through it, like in the middle of looking on it to see the call.
Cool.
But I haven't got down to the charts yet.
Awesome. Okay. And I think, so it's hard right now to read into duration and cost numbers because we have, I'll say, other factors that are increasing them outside of just this experiment. So it's hard to make any judgment in isolation of this experiment on how the cost and duration is being impacted. Is that fair to say, Albert?
Yeah, there's other factors coming into picture as well.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. It's been really helpful for. Oh, go ahead, Drew.
I would just say, for what it's worth, if we wanted that number, we could probably back it out from the miss rate and the time to failure of the actual of the true negatives and the false negatives. So I think that number is gettable.
Which number? Oh, there's cost savings.
Yeah. We could go with the time to failures and then work back and figure out the costs. But observably, like this is, I think, a lot harder.
Yeah, I would agree with that because we know the average number of pipelines, not average of failing aspect jobs and the cancellation rate, for example. Yeah. I think we can get to that number.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe as we implement more with dynamic mapping, we can look towards that. I was hoping just using some of the charts we had, we could see some more pronounced trends. But just with the current implementation, we're just not able to.
Yeah, so just on the chart, so I added this average 10-day average on the cost of failed pipelines, failed MR pipelines, and I'm not sure if it's this. I mean, there might be other reasons for it, but at least from what I see now, where when we first started the experiment, they showed it's about 16 September. So I saw like a slight increase on the 10-day average, but it has then come back up, which could have been because of just general code-based growth, the number of tests increasing.
Yeah, I like Drew's idea of just focusing in on where we know the pipeline was short-circuited, just trying to see, like we can look at how much time savings and how much cost we have just on that subset of pipelines. But
fortunately, we run so many pipelines that we could probably look at. We might even be able to look at it on a daily basis, and just to try and control for the the size of the CI suite, if you will. In a single day, you could look at how much did the fast failures cost and how much did the long failures cost on a day, and we might have enough pipelines for that number to be meaningful.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we realized was that, sorry, there's a lot of fighter jets flying over. Okay, yeah, so what I was saying was, so if we look at this chart, we're not seeing as many cancellations happening that we expected, because I think it's actually a good thing that most pipelines are completely passing, and it's based on what we think is affected to that, what's related to that MR. Yeah. So this is something that is new to us as well. Like, we thought that we would see more cancellation, but it's not as high as we thought it would be. Yeah.
Drew, do you have any more questions on the implementation or data? Anything here?
No, I'm good. Thank you both for this.
Yeah, Albert, thanks a lot for the time and walking through this. I recorded it. I'll upload this to GitLab Unfiltered and share it in the issue so that James and Ricky can check it out tomorrow morning my time. Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Thanks for
joining, Drew. Yeah, thanks, Albert. Did you have something else you wanted to share there?
No.
Okay. Okay. All right. I'm gonna hop off. Thank you everyone for the time, and I'll catch you later async. See ya.